Tonight you'll witness the most unusual war in history. One where skeletons apologize for being late to their own resurrection, where village children teach undead warriors new games, and where the fate of both living and dead hangs not on the clash of steel, but on the simple power of friendship and understanding. Now before we witness this extraordinary tale of dancing bones and unlikely alliances unfold, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding comfort in these gentle stories that help you drift peacefully into sleep, consider giving this video a like. Think of it as lighting a candle for all the souls living and dead who find solace in shared stories. If you'd like to share tonight's adventure with someone who might need a peaceful tale before bed, that sharing becomes its own kind of magic, connecting dreamers across the world like threads in an invisible tapestry. And if you'd like to subscribe to join our growing community of midnight storytellers, you'll ensure that more tales like this one find their way to you each week, like old friends returning with new adventures to help guide you to restful sleep. You find yourself walking slowly down the main street of Millhausen, a village so small and close-knit that everyone knows not only everyone else's business, but their grandmother's business, their cousin's business, and probably their livestock's business as well. The village consists of perhaps 30 families, all living in timber-framed houses that lean companionably toward each other across the narrow cobblestone lane, like old friends sharing secrets. Their thatched roofs create a patchwork of shadows and silver patches in the moonlight, each roof telling its own story through the careful arrangement of straw, the age of the timber supports, and the small details that mark each household's character. Your footsteps echo softly against the stones, a gentle rhythm that seems to harmonize with the night sounds around you. The soft rustle of straw in the wind, the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night, the occasional creak of a wooden shutter adjusting to the cool air. Through latticed windows you catch glimpses of families gathered around their hearths, each scene painted in warm orange and yellow light that spills out onto the street like liquid gold. In the window of the cooper's house you see Margaret's father Johann working by candlelight on a new barrel, his skilled hands shaping the wooden staves with the patience of a craftsman who takes pride in work that will last generations. His wife sits nearby, mending clothes with tiny, precise stitches while humming a lullaby that seems to float on the night air like a prayer. Their daughter Margaret should be asleep in her small bed in the loft, but you catch a glimpse of her face peering down from the ladder, eyes bright with curiosity about the unusually bright night. You pause outside the blacksmith's shop where Hans the smith has left his tools, carefully arranged for tomorrow's work. Each hammer, tong, and file has its proper place, evidence of a man who understands that order in the workshop leads to excellence in the craft. The forge still radiates gentle warmth through the stone walls, and you can almost hear the phantom ring of hammer on anvil that will resume with the dawn, that steady rhythm that marks the heartbeat of any prosperous village. His apprentice Willem, a boy of perhaps 14 with arms already growing strong from working, the bellows has forgotten to close the shutters completely. Through the gap, you see him practicing his letters by the dying embers, his tongue poking out in concentration as he traces characters in the ash-covered surface of his writing slate. The sight fills you with warmth. Here is a boy reaching beyond his station, hungry for knowledge that might lift him from the life of manual labor into something more. In this age, literacy is still a rare gift, usually reserved for the clergy and the nobility. But Willem's master is a kind man who believes that a smith who can read and calculate will create better work than one who relies only on the strength of his arm. The baker's wife, Greta, emerges from her shop carrying a large wicker basket covered with a clean linen cloth. She moves with the quiet efficiency of someone engaged in a familiar ritual, her wooden clogs clicking softly against the cobblestones as she makes her way from door to door. You realize she's leaving small loaves of day-old bread on specific doorsteps, the homes of the village's poorest families, the widow with too many children to feed the old soldier who lost his arm in some long-forgotten border war and struggles to earn enough coin for proper meals. This is clearly a regular occurrence conducted with the practiced stealth of someone who has been secretly feeding her neighbors for years. When she notices you watching from the shadows, she places a finger to her lips with a conspiratorial smile that transforms her weathered face into something beautiful. "The moon is bright enough to see kindness tonight, isn't it, friend?" she whispers, her voice carrying just far enough to reach your ears. You nod, deeply touched by this simple act of generosity that expects no recognition or reward. In a world where winter hunger is a real threat, and every grain of wheat represents survival itself, Greta's quiet charity speaks to something profound about the human spirit, the way ordinary people can choose to be extraordinary when no one is watching. She continues her rounds, and you watch until she disappears around the corner toward the poorer section of the village, where the houses are smaller and the thatched roofs show more patches and repairs. The village well stands at the center of the square like an ancient monument to community cooperation. Its stone rim has been worn smooth by countless hands, drawing water each person's daily needs, contributing to the gentle curves and depressions that now catch and hold the moonlight like small pools of liquid silver. Someone has left a wooden bucket beside it, and the rope dangles into the dark depths below, disappearing into mystery. If you listen carefully, placing your ear near the opening, you can hear the faint drip, drip, drip of water echoing up from the bottom. A steady heartbeat in the stillness that seems to mark the pulse of the village itself. The well represents more than just a source of water. It's the social center where news is shared, gossip is exchanged, and the daily business of community life unfolds. You can almost see the phantom figures of all the people who have gathered here over the years, young mothers drawing water while their children play at their feet, old men sharing stories and wisdom, young lovers stealing moments together under the stars. Beyond the houses, the fields stretch out like a dark sea under the moonlight, dotted with haystacks that look like sleeping giants in the silvery illumination. Each haystack represents weeks of backbreaking labor during the harvest season, entire families working from dawn to dusk to gather the grain that will sustain them through the long winter months. The harvest was good this year. You can tell by the way people walk with lighter steps, by the small luxuries that have begun appearing in windows, a brass candlestick that catches and reflects the firelight, a bright ribbon tied around a young girl's braid, a child's wooden toy horse painted in cheerful colors and left proudly on a windowsill where everyone can admire the craftsmanship. These small signs speak to the difference between mere survival and actual prosperity, between a community that simply endures and one that has enough surplus to invest in beauty, in joy in the small things that make life worth living. But it's what lies beyond the fields that draws your attention tonight, pulling at your consciousness like a gentle but insistent hand. Rising like a gentle hill in the distance, perhaps a quarter mile from the village proper, you can see the old cemetery. Its stone markers and wooden crosses create a silent congregation under the stars, each grave representing someone who once walked these same streets, drew water from this same well, worked in these same fields. The cemetery tells the story of generations, the elaborate stone monuments of the founding families, the simple wooden crosses of farmers and craftsmen, the small heartbreaking markers that commemorate children who never had the chance to grow up. The moss-covered stones, so old that their inscriptions have become unreadable mysteries. The church that serves the village sits beside the cemetery like a patient guardian, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a prayer made of stone and timber. The structure is not grand by the standards of cathedral cities, but it represents the community's faith and aspiration, made manifest in oak beams and fieldstone walls. The bell itself was cast 3 generations ago, paid for by the collective sacrifice of every family in the village, and its voice has marked every important moment in their shared history. Births and deaths, marriages and harvests, celebrations and sorrows. Father Aldrich would have finished evening prayers hours ago, leading the small congregation through the familiar Latin phrases that connect this remote village to the vast web of Christendom that spans the known world. You picture him now in his small chamber beside the church, perhaps reading by candlelight from one of the precious books that represent the entirety of the village's literary heritage, or copying passages from sacred texts with the careful penmanship that preserves knowledge for future generations. His quill scratches gently across parchment, each letter formed with the devotion of someone who understands that he is participating in something larger than himself. Father Aldrich is a kind man known throughout the village for his gentle counsel and his habit of accidentally leaving food on the graves of the recently departed. He claims it's for the birds, but somehow the poorest families in the village always discover these offerings come morning, and no one asks too many questions about this convenient coincidence. The priest understands that sometimes practical charity is more important than theological precision. As you stand in the square, breathing in the peaceful atmosphere and feeling the weight of centuries settling around you like a comfortable cloak, a small tabby cat emerges from the shadows. The cat moves with that peculiar feline combination of dignity and curiosity, winding around your ankles and purring softly, a sound like a tiny engine of contentment. You reach down to stroke its fur, and it rewards you with a friendly headbutt against your palm, that unmistakable cat greeting that transcends species and centuries. Even the animals seem more relaxed on a night like this, as if the bright moon has cast a spell of tranquility over everything that lives and breathes in this small corner of the world. The cat follows you for a few steps, then wanders off toward the baker's shop, probably hoping for a scrap of something delicious. You decide to walk toward the edge of the village, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity and the perfect clarity of the night. The moon seems to be calling you forward, promising mysteries and adventures that await in the darkness beyond the comfortable circle of human habitation. Your shadow stretches long and thin beside you, a dark companion, dancing on the cobblestones, sometimes ahead and sometimes behind, as you move between the pools of light that spill from cottage windows. The air grows cooler as you leave the last houses behind, and you pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fabric is rough but warm, woven by local hands from the wool of local sheep, dyed with colors extracted from local plants. Another reminder of how completely this community depends on itself and the land around it for survival. As you follow the winding dirt path that leads from the village toward the cemetery, the character of the night begins to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. The familiar sounds of the village fade gradually behind you, the occasional creak of settling timber as houses adjust to the cooling air, the soft hoot of an owl calling from the church bell tower, the distant lowing of cattle in their barns, the gentle murmur of a late conversation drifting through an open window, replaced by the deeper, more primal sounds of the countryside at night. Here, away from human habitation, you become aware of the vast network of life that thrives in darkness. somewhere in the fields, small creatures rustle through the grain stubble, mice and voles, going about their nightly business of survival barn cats on the hunt, hedgehogs shuffling through the underbrush in search of insects and grubs. An owl calls from a distant tree, its voice carrying across the landscape like a question posed to the night itself. But beneath these familiar night sounds, you begin to notice something else, a subtle wrongness that makes you pause on the path and tilt your head, trying to identify exactly what has changed. The ground beneath your feet feels different, not quite solid, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. At first you wonder if you're imagining things, but no, there's definitely a subtle tremor, so faint you might mistake it for your own heartbeat if you weren't paying close attention. You kneel down and place your palm flat against the dirt path. Through the leather of your glove you can feel it more clearly now, a rhythmic vibration like a vast heart beating somewhere deep beneath the surface of the world. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's definitely not natural. In all your years of wandering country paths at night, you've never felt anything quite like this. The cemetery gate stands perhaps 50 yards ahead, and even from this distance you can see that something is amiss. The iron gate, which you distinctly remember being closed and latched when you passed this way earlier in the day, now stands slightly ajar. The hinges, usually so rusty they protest any movement with harsh squeals that can be heard, throughout the village appear to swing silently in the gentle night breeze. Someone has been here recently, but who ventures to the cemetery this late at night? The villagers are not a superstitious people exactly, but they have a healthy respect for the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Cemetery visits are typically restricted to daylight hours and usually only for the practical business of tending graves or conducting funerals. As you approach the gate, you notice other small details that seem out of place. The iron itself, which should be cold to the touch on a night like this, radiates a subtle warmth when you brush your fingers against it. The metal has been recently oiled, you can tell, by the way it moves smoothly and silently and by the faint scent of linseed oil that hangs in the air. You push the gate open wider and step inside, your footsteps now silent on the grass that grows thick and lush between the graves. The cemetery is older than the village itself, with some stones dating back 3 centuries or more, to the time when this area was part of a different kingdom entirely, when different languages were spoken and different customs observed. The layout tells the story of the community's evolution. Near the entrance where you now stand, the newer graves are marked with simple wooden crosses or modest stone markers, bearing inscriptions in the local dialect. The wood is oak or ash, carefully carved by local craftsmen who take pride in creating something beautiful, even for the dead. The stone markers are made from the same limestone found in the nearby quarry, cut and polished by masons who learned their trade from their fathers and grandfathers. But as you venture deeper into the cemetery, following the winding paths that curve around ancient oak trees, whose roots probably predate the oldest graves, the monuments become more elaborate and mysterious. Here stand the ancient family crypts of long-forgotten noble houses, elaborate stone edifices decorated with carved angels whose faces have been worn smooth by centuries of weather-weathered headstones bearing Latin inscriptions too faded to read in the moonlight, and old Celtic crosses that predate the church itself, remnants of an older faith that existed here before Christianity arrived, with its promise of salvation and its demand for theological conformity. These older sections of the cemetery feel different from the newer areas, heavier somehow, weighted with the accumulated presence of centuries. The grass grows differently here, thicker and darker, as if fed by richer soil. The trees are older and more gnarled, their branches reaching toward each other to create a canopy that filters the moonlight into shifting patterns of silver and shadow. The moon, impossibly bright tonight, casts everything in sharp relief that seems almost artificial in its clarity. Every blade of grass appears to glow with its own inner light, and the shadows between the graves seem deeper and more mysterious than usual, as if they contain secrets that are just beyond the reach of understanding. You can see your breath forming small clouds in the cool air, each exhalation a visible reminder of the difference between your warm living presence and the cold, eternal sleep that surrounds you. You pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, but the chill you feel seems to come from something more than just the night air. There's a quality to the cold that feels ancient, timeless, as if it has been waiting here for centuries. As you walk among the graves, your eyes adjusting to the interplay of moonlight and shadow, you begin to notice odd details that make you pause and look more closely. The earth around several of the older plots appears disturbed, not freshly dug, which would suggest recent burial activity, but shifted somehow as if something had pushed up from below with gentle but persistent pressure. You kneel beside one such grave, a modest plot marked with a limestone headstone, whose inscription has been worn almost smooth by time and weather. You can just make out what might be a name, Heinrich something or other, and a date that looks like it might be from the early 1200s. Running your fingers over the soil, you discover that it's loose and crumbly, nothing like the packed earth that should cover a burial site that's been undisturbed for 2.5 centuries. The soil feels warm to the touch, another impossibility that adds to the growing sense that this night is unlike any other. You scoop up a handful of the earth and let it run through your fingers. It has the consistency of freshly turned garden soil, rich and dark and full of the promise of new growth. But this is a grave, a place of endings, not beginning. A sound catches your attention as you're contemplating this mystery, a rhythmic tapping like someone drumming their fingers against wood in a steady, patient rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seems to come from directly beneath your feet, and you realize with a start that you're standing on the grave you've been examining. You follow the sound as it grows louder and more insistent, moving deeper into the cemetery, past the massive tomb of the von Milhausen family, the village's original founding family, whose elaborate mausoleum speaks to wealth and power that has long since passed into history. The structure is impressive even by noble standards: carved granite angels standing eternal watch, intricate stone roses that seem almost alive in the shifting moonlight, and an inscription in Latin that proclaims the family's devotion to God and their confidence in eventual resurrection. You continue past the modest graves of plague victims from 2 generations ago, their markers clustered together in a section that tells its own tragic story of a community under siege from invisible death. The plague had taken nearly 1/3 of the village in the space of one terrible summer, leaving behind grieving families and economic devastation that took years to overcome. Beyond these lie the small section reserved for unbaptized children and strangers who died passing through the people who existed on the margins of the community's religious and social structure. Their graves are marked with simple wooden crosses or rough field stones, but even these humble markers are tended with care. Death, the villagers understand, is the great equalizer that renders social distinctions meaningless. The tapping grows louder as you move through this geography of memory and loss, more insistent now, as if whatever is making the sound has sensed your presence and is trying to communicate. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm is too regular to be accidental, too purposeful to be explained by settling earth or burrowing animals. You find yourself standing on one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, in a section where the headstones are so weathered that their original inscriptions have become illegible mysteries. This particular marker is carved from some dark stone, perhaps slate or granite, and decorated with symbols that predate Christian iconography, carved skulls and crossbones hourglasses, that mark the passage of time and other memento mori that remind the living of their own mortality. The skull carving seems to grin at you in the moonlight, but there's nothing malevolent about the expression. Instead, it feels almost welcoming, as if inviting you to contemplate the mystery of existence and the thin boundary between life and death. You step back from the grave, your heart beginning to beat a little faster, but not with fear, with excitement, the same sensation you might feel before unwrapping a mysterious gift or opening a letter that promises to change everything you thought you knew about the world. The tapping stops abruptly, replaced by a new sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, a low rumbling like distant thunder, but clearly coming from underground. The sound grows stronger, and you feel it in your bones now, a vibration that seems to resonate with something deep in your chest, as if your own heartbeat is trying to synchronize with whatever force is building beneath your feet. Other graves throughout the cemetery begin to show signs of disturbance. The earth cracks in thin lines that spread outward like the pattern of a spider's web, creating geometric designs that seem almost deliberate in their complexity. Pebbles and dried leaves dance on the surface of the graves, jiggling to the rhythm of whatever force is building beneath the surface of the world. The rumbling grows stronger, and now you can see small stones and clods of earth jumping and bouncing as if the ground itself has developed a case of nervous tremors. The sound builds to a crescendo that seems to come from everywhere at once, not just from beneath the particular grave where you're standing, but from the entire cemetery, as if the earth itself is preparing to give birth to something unprecedented. Then, just as you're beginning to wonder if you should return to the village and raise the alarm, the rumbling stops with shocking suddenness. The cemetery falls into an absolute silence so complete it feels like being underwater or standing inside a vast, empty cathedral. Even the wind has died, and the usual nighttime chorus of insects has ceased entirely. The only sounds are your own breathing and the gentle whisper of your cloak moving against itself as you turn to look around the suddenly motionless landscape. The silence stretches on for what feels like minutes, but is probably only seconds' time, taking on that elastic quality it has in moments of high tension when every heartbeat seems to last an eternity. You're about to turn and leave, convinced that whatever was happening has passed, when something extraordinary occurs. A pale hand, bone white in the moonlight, and moving with surprising delicacy, pushes through the earth of the grave at your feet, like a flower emerging from soil in the first days of spring. The hand that emerges from the earth moves with a grace that seems to defy everything you thought you knew about death and resurrection. The fingers flex experimentally as if testing the air, and you realize with a mixture of fascination and wonder that what you're witnessing has nothing in common with the terrifying tales of shambling corpses and mindless undead that fill the stories told around winter fires. This is something altogether different, refined, dignified, almost courtly in its deliberate movements. The skin is pale as parchment, and as more of the arm becomes visible, you realize with a start that it's not skin at all. What you're seeing is bone bleached white and smooth as polished ivory, yet somehow warm-looking in the silver moonlight. The bones are not the yellow, brittle remains you might expect from ancient burials, but something that appears almost alive, if such a thing can be said about skeletal remains. You should be terrified. Any reasonable person would run screaming back to the village, raising the alarm and rousing the priest to perform whatever rites might be necessary to put the dead back in their proper place. But instead, you find yourself utterly fascinated, watching as a second hand appears, then an arm, then a shoulder, emerging from the earth with the patient care of someone getting dressed for an important occasion. The skeleton, for that's clearly what this is, sits up in the grave with the thoughtful deliberation of someone who has just awakened from a very long nap and needs a moment to remember where they are and why they're there. Earth falls from its bones like water, leaving no trace of the soil that should cling to remains that have been buried for centuries. The skeleton brushes more dirt from its ribs with the casual air of someone dusting off their clothes after a day's work in the garden. When it turns toward you, the empty sockets where eyes should be glow with a gentle red light that reminds you not of hellfire or malevolent magic, but of embers in a comfortable fireplace on a cold winter evening. There's something unmistakably intelligent about that glow, something that suggests personality and humor and human warmth, despite the obvious absence of humanity in any conventional sense. "Well," says the skeleton, in a voice like rustling autumn leaves, cultured and refined with the accent of someone well-educated, "that was a longer sleep than I intended." It looks around the cemetery with what you can only interpret as mild confusion, taking in the unfamiliar headstones and the changes that centuries have wrought on the landscape. "Has anyone been tending the roses? I specifically asked for roses to be planted on my grave. They were to be yellow ones, I believe, or perhaps white." Memory becomes somewhat unreliable after a few centuries of unconsciousness. You blink, wondering if you're dreaming, or if you've somehow stumbled into a fairy tale that has decided to unfold in the real world. The skeleton's voice carries the kind of authority and education that suggests nobility, or at least significant social standing. Nothing like the mindless groaning you might expect from the undead. "Oh," the skeleton continues, apparently noticing your stare, and suddenly realizing that proper introductions are in order. "How terribly rude of me. Sir Bedivere Thorncastle, Knight, Commander of the King's Third Heavy Horse. Order of the Golden Griffin, veteran of the campaigns against the northern barbarians, and currently, it seems, somewhat deceased, at your service." It attempts a bow while still sitting in the grave, which creates an awkwardly comic effect that transforms what should be a terrifying encounter into something almost charming. The gesture is performed with such earnest courtesy that you find yourself wanting to return the bow despite the absurdity of the situation. "I don't suppose you could give me a hand up?" Sir Bedivere continues with the matter-of-fact tone of someone asking for help, reaching a book from a high shelf. "It's been quite some time since I've needed to use these old bones, and I'm finding the coordination somewhat challenging. Rather like learning to walk again, except with the added complication of having no muscles or connective tissue to work with." Before you can respond to this remarkable request, the ground around you begins to shift again, but this time the movement is more widespread and more dramatic. Throughout the cemetery, more hands push through the earth, followed by more arms, more shoulders, more skeletal forms emerging from their resting places with varying degrees of grace and coordination. Some rise smoothly, as if they've been practicing this maneuver for centuries and have it down to a fine art. Others struggle comically with the mechanics of resurrection, trying to remember how arms and legs work after decades or centuries of disuse. You watch mesmerized as what appears to be an entire military unit reassembles itself in the moonlight, each skeleton wearing the remnants of medieval armor and weaponry. These are clearly soldiers, you can tell by the rusted chainmail and tattered surcoats that still cling to their bones, displaying heraldic devices that speak of long-forgotten allegiances and battles. Many still wear the remnants of armor, a breastplate here, a gauntlet there, a helmet that sits askew on a grinning skull and gives its wearer a rakish, almost piratical appearance. The variety of their equipment tells the story of a military unit that has seen extensive service. Some wear the elaborate armor of knights with carefully crafted plates and decorative elements that speak to both wealth and status. Others display the simpler but more practical gear of professional soldiers. Chainmail shirts, leather jerkins, reinforced with metal studs, helmets designed for protection rather than display. One skeleton near you is having particular trouble with his equipment, and his frustration is both audible and amusing. His sword has somehow become tangled in his own ribcage during the resurrection process, and he's pulling at it with increasing exasperation while muttering what sound like very creative oaths in a language that might be Latin, might be some regional dialect, or might be something else entirely. "Blast this infernal contraption," he grumbles, giving the sword another tug. 200 years of peaceful rest and the bloody thing has been jabbing me in the ribs the entire time. You'd think being dead would mean an end to minor annoyances, but apparently not. "Need help with that, Roderick?" asks Sir Bedivere, now standing beside you and adjusting what appears to be the remains of a once magnificent cloak. The fabric is faded and tattered, but you can still make out traces of embroidery that must have been spectacular when new golden threads forming the image of a griffin silver trim along the edges and a clasp that still bears the remnants of precious stones. "This bloody thing has been poking at me for centuries," Roderick replies, giving the sword another frustrated tug. "Every time I tried to settle into a comfortable position there, it was stabbing away like a persistent mosquito. I swear if I ever meet the idiot who decided I should be buried with my weapons—" "That would be you, old friend," Sir Bedivere points out gently. "You specifically requested to be interred with your sword, your shield, and your lucky dagger. Something about being ready for the final battle, as I recall." "Well, that was a spectacularly poor decision." Roderick grumbles, finally managing to work the sword free with a grinding sound of metal against bone. "Next time I die, remind me to request burial with something more comfortable. A good book, perhaps, or a bottle of wine." All around you, similar scenes of comic resurrection are playing out with the kind of good-natured chaos you might expect from a military unit that's been out of service for an extended period. A skeleton archer is trying to string a bow with fingers that keep slipping off the cord, the bones lacking the friction that flesh would provide. Each attempt sends the bow clattering to the ground, and each failure is met with increasingly colourful expressions of frustration. Another skeleton is hopping on one foot trying to pull a boot onto what is clearly no longer a foot-shaped appendage. The leather has somehow survived the centuries, probably preserved by the same mysterious force that has awakened these soldiers, but it was designed for flesh and muscle, not bare bone. A third undead warrior has managed to get his helmet on backward and is now spinning in circles, trying to figure out why everything looks wrong and why he keeps walking into tombstones. His confused wandering creates a sort of undead ballet as other skeletons dodge out of his way while dealing with their own equipment malfunctions. "Is this normal, you ask?" Sir Bedivere, gesturing at the chaos unfolding around you. Your voice sounds surprisingly calm, considering that you're having a casual conversation with a talking skeleton in the middle of a mass resurrection event. "Normal." Sir Bedivere chuckles, a sound like dice rattling in a leather cup. "My dear fellow, there's absolutely nothing normal about tonight. We weren't supposed to wake up for another." He pauses, tilting his skull in thought. "What century is this again? Time becomes rather fluid when you're dead." You tell him it's 1456, and he nods thoughtfully, or at least performs the skeletal equivalent of a thoughtful nod. "Ah, bit early then. We were meant to wake for the Battle of Well, it's quite complicated, actually. Something about convergences and prophecies and mystical alignments. Frankly, I never paid much attention to the mystical bits when we received our orders. I was always more interested in the practical aspects of warfare, supply lines, troop morale, tactical positioning, that sort of thing. Your orders, buys. You ask, increasingly intrigued by the suggestion that this resurrection is part of some larger plan rather than a random supernatural event. Oh yes, we're not here by accident. Sir Bedivere explains, beginning to walk slowly through the cemetery as his men continue their various struggles with equipment and coordination. We were bound by sacred oath to rise again when the need was greatest, when darkness threatened to overwhelm the light, when evil sought to triumph over good. The usual apocalyptic nonsense, though I must say the reality, is proving rather different from the briefings. As if summoned by his words, a horn sounds in the distance, a deep, resonant note that seems to come from the village below. It's followed by another horn, then another, creating an urgent fanfare that echoes across the countryside and reaches even the farthest corners of the cemetery. The sound has an immediate effect on both you and the assembled skeletons. For you, it represents the familiar sound of alarm, the call that summons the village to defend itself against danger. For the skeletons, it seems to trigger something deeper, some ingrained military instinct that transcends death itself.
Ah, says Sir Bedivere with evident satisfaction. That would be our cue, the battle's about to begin.
The other skeletons immediately cease their individual struggles and fall into formation with the smooth precision of soldiers who have drilled together for years, who know each other's movements and capabilities as well as they know their own. Weapons are suddenly in proper hands. Armor is straightened with swift, efficient movements, and the ragtag collection of confused undead transforms into a proper military unit that would not look out of place on any medieval battlefield. The transformation is remarkable to witness. These are clearly professional soldiers, men who devoted their lives to the art of war and whose skills have somehow survived the transition from life to death. They form ranks automatically, each man taking his proper position based on weapon type and experience, creating a formation that speaks to decades of training and battlefield experience. What's happening? You ask, though even as the words leave your mouth, you can see torches beginning to flicker to life in the village below. The alarm has been raised and the people of Milhausen are awakening to discover that their peaceful night has taken a decidedly unusual turn. War, my friend, Sir Bedivere says, placing a surprisingly gentle hand on your shoulder. The touch is cool, but not unpleasant like marble that has been warmed by winter sunlight. Though I suspect it will be rather different from the wars we remember. These people don't look like the kind of enemy we were expecting to face. He gestures toward the village where lights are blooming in windows like flowers opening to the dawn, and you can see small figures moving about in apparent preparation for defense. The sight fills you with a mixture of excitement and concern. Excitement for the unprecedented nature of what you're witnessing, concern for the innocent people who are about to find themselves facing an army of the undead. What were you expecting, if you ask? Sir Bedivere considers this question while watching his men complete their formation. Something more apocalyptic, I suppose. Demons, perhaps. Certainly not a collection of farmers and craftsmen who appear to be defending their homes. This is not at all what the prophecies suggested. The skeleton army now stands in perfect ranks, moonlight gleaming off their weapons and armor, ready for battle. But there's something almost anticlimactic about their preparation, as if they're actors who have rehearsed for one play and suddenly discovered they're performing in something completely different. You find yourself caught between two worlds. Behind you, an army of undead medieval soldiers preparing for a war they don't fully understand. And below you, a village full of innocent people preparing to defend themselves against a threat they couldn't possibly comprehend. Somehow, you sense that you're about to witness something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. The bells of the village church begin to ring with frantic urgency. Not the measured tolls that mark the hours of prayer or call the faithful to worship, but the harsh, chaotic clanging that speaks of emergency and mortal danger. From your vantage point on the hill, you can see Father Aldrich silhouetted in the bell tower, a dark figure against the moonlit sky, pulling the rope with desperate energy. His robes flap around him like the wings of a large, panicked bird, and you can almost see the sweat on his face despite the cool night air as he throws his entire body weight into each pull of the bell rope. The sound carries across the countryside with startling clarity, a bronze voice shouting alarm to anyone within miles. This is not the gentle call to evening prayers or the joyful pealing that celebrates marriages and feast days, but the harsh cry that has summoned communities to defense for hundreds of years. Down in the village, the effect is immediate and dramatic. Lights bloom in windows like stars appearing in the evening sky, but these are not the warm, cozy glows of families gathered around their hearths. These are the sharp, practical flames of people who have been jolted from sleep and are grabbing whatever comes to hand. Candles snatched from bedside tables, oil lamps hastily lit with trembling fingers, torches improvised from bundles of straw dipped in kitchen grease and set alight with whatever fire source is available. The transformation of the village from sleeping community to armed camp happens with remarkable speed. Windows that had been dark moments before now frame urgent scenes of preparation, shadowy figures moving quickly back and forth, the glint of metal as weapons are retrieved from storage, the hurried gestures of people trying to dress for battle while half awake and thoroughly confused about what exactly they're supposed to be fighting. You find yourself caught between two worlds now, behind you the skeleton army, forming ranks with increasing efficiency, their supernatural discipline making them look like a military unit that has trained together for decades. Below you the village stirring to life like a kicked anthill, all chaos and confusion but with an underlying current of determination that speaks well of these people's courage. From your position on the hillside you have a perfect view of both forces preparing for what promises to be the most unusual confrontation in military history. The contrast could not be more striking, the supernatural precision of the undead soldiers against the chaotic but spirited improvisation of ordinary people suddenly called upon to defend their homes. In the village square, Hans the smith emerges from his shop like a bear emerging from hibernation. Large, powerful, and not entirely pleased about being awakened. He carries his massive work hammer in one hand and wears what appears to be a hastily assembled collection of pots and pans as a makeshift armor. The effect is both comic and oddly impressive. This is clearly a man who understands that in the absence of proper military equipment, you use whatever comes to hand, and you use it with confidence. His apprentice, Willem, follows behind him, struggling under the weight of a proper sword that's clearly too large for his young frame. The weapon was probably made for a full-grown knight, and Willem's attempts to carry it with proper martial dignity result in him staggering slightly with each step. But his face shows determination rather than fear, the expression of a young man who has decided that whatever is happening, he will meet it with courage rather than cowering. Willem! Hans calls over his shoulder, his voice carrying the authority of a master craftsman who has spent years teaching young men the difference between courage and foolishness. Remember what I taught you about the balance point? But Master Hans. Willem pants, adjusting his grip on the unwieldy sword. I thought you were teaching me to make horseshoes and fix wagon wheels. Same principle, lad, Hans replies with the practical wisdom of a man who sees the underlying structure in all things. Find the balance, apply pressure at the right point, and try not to hit yourself in the foot, And keep your guard up, a sword is just a very specialized hammer when you think about it properly. The baker's wife Greta has somehow appointed herself as the village's emergency coordinator, a role for which her years of managing a successful bakery have apparently prepared her admirably. She stands in the center of the square with a large wooden ladle in one hand and a rolling pin in the other, directing people with the brisk authority of someone who has spent years organizing complex operations under pressure. Bertha, take the children to the church basement. She calls to the miller's wife, pointing toward the stone building with its promise of thick walls and defensible positions. Johann, stop standing there gawking like a tourist and help me with these barricades. And someone please do something about Farmer Klaus. He's trying to fight supernatural creatures with a fishing net again. Indeed, Farmer Klaus, apparently having misunderstood the nature of the threat entirely, has appeared in the square carrying his largest fishing net and wearing what appears to be a cooking pot as a helmet. His wife trails behind him, making increasingly desperate attempts to explain that skeletal warriors are not in fact unusually large fish, but Klaus seems convinced that his years of experience with eels and trout have given him unique qualifications for undead combat. Mark my words, woman, Klaus declares with the confidence of a man who has never let ignorance interfere with his certainty. Anything with bones can be caught in a net. It's just a matter of proper technique and timing. I've been fishing these streams for 40 years, and I know bone structure when I see it. When Klaus, they're not fish, his wife protests, but her husband waves her off with the dismissive gesture of an expert who will not be contradicted by amateurs.
Nonsense. Look at the way they move, all angular and streamlined. Classic fish behavior. Trust me on this, Margaret. I know what I'm about.
You watch fascinated as the village transforms from a sleepy rural community into something resembling a military encampment, though one organized by people whose primary experience with warfare comes from stories told around winter fires. Wagons are overturned to create barricades, though no one seems entirely sure what they're supposed to be hiding behind them. Pitchforks appear from barns and sheds, transformed from agricultural tools into improvised weapons through nothing more than desperate necessity and human ingenuity. Someone has even managed to produce a crossbow from somewhere, though judging by the way several people are gathered around it arguing about how to load it, no one is entirely sure how to operate the device. The weapon appears to be an heirloom from some previous generation, perhaps kept as a reminder of more dangerous times, and its current owners are attempting to figure out its operation through trial and error. The village's only knight, Sir Edmund, a younger son of a minor noble family, who was granted a small fief here after distinguishing himself in some forgotten border skirmish, emerges from his modest manor house, wearing proper armor and carrying a sword that actually looks like it was designed for fighting rather than farm work. Sir Edmund represents the village's single concession to military professionalism, though his experience has been limited to minor skirmishes with bandits and the occasional dispute over grazing rights. He's a good man, honest and dedicated to protecting his people, but nothing in his training has prepared him for the sight of an entire army of undead warriors forming ranks on the hillside above his village. Citizens of Millhausen, he calls, his voice carrying clearly in the cool night air with the trained projection of someone who has given orders on battlefields. Form defensive positions, protect the church and the square, and for the love of all that's holy, someone please explain to me what exactly we're defending against.
As if in answer to his question, the skeleton army crests the hill and becomes fully visible to the villagers below. The effect is immediate and dramatic. Several people scream, not the theatrical screams of stage productions, but the genuine cries of people confronted with something that challenges their understanding of the natural order. Someone drops a torch, creating a brief moment of panic, as others rush to stamp out the flames before they can spread to the thatched roofs that surround the square.
Farmer Klaus, observing the approaching skeletal army, nods with evident satisfaction. "See, I told you they were fish. Look at that formation, classic schooling behaviour. We'll have them netted and sorted before dawn, mark my words." His wife gives up arguing and begins looking around for something heavy to hit him with, apparently deciding that unconsciousness might be an improvement over his current state of militant ignorance. But to your surprise, not everyone in the village reacts with fear or confusion. The elderly priest, Father Aldrich, has climbed down from the bell tower and now stands in front of the church with his arms raised toward the approaching army. His voice carries across the distance as he begins what sounds like an impromptu sermon delivered with the confidence of a man who has spent decades finding theological solutions to practical problems. Brothers in bone. He calls out, his voice surprisingly strong for a man of his years. What brings you from your rest on this blessed night? Do you seek salvation, redemption? Or perhaps just a decent meal and a warm place to sleep? All souls are welcome in the house of the Lord, regardless of their current state of corporeal existence. Several villagers stare at him in disbelief, wondering if the stress of the situation has finally caused their priest to lose his grip on reality. Greta the baker marches over and tugs on his robes with the brisk efficiency of someone who has spent years managing people who don't always make sensible decisions.
Father, as she hisses, I don't think they're here for evening prayers. They're carrying weapons, and they're dead, and they're probably not interested in theological discussions. Nonsense, my dear woman, Father Aldrich replies with the serene confidence of someone whose faith has never been seriously challenged. Every soul seeks comfort regardless of its current housing situation. These poor fellows have probably been sleeping rough for centuries. The least we can do is offer them hospitality. They're an army of undead warriors, Father. They've probably come to destroy the village.
Father Aldrich looks genuinely puzzled by this suggestion. But why would they want to destroy the village? We're not particularly threatening, and our harvest was quite good this year. Surely they'd prefer to trade rather than raid. I've always found that most conflicts can be resolved through honest conversation and perhaps a shared meal. Meanwhile, up the hill with the skeleton army, similar preparations are taking place, though with notably more organization and significantly less panic. Sir Bedivere has produced a horn from somewhere, possibly from one of the graves, though you don't want to speculate too closely about the details and sounds. 3 clear notes that bring the scattered undead warriors into perfect formation. The horn call is beautiful. In its simplicity, a brass voice that speaks of military tradition and professional discipline. Each note rings across the hillside with mathematical precision, and the response from the skeleton soldiers is immediate and impressive. They form ranks as if connected by invisible strings, each warrior taking his proper position based on weapon type, experience, and tactical function. Right then, Sir Bedivere announces, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has commanded troops in actual battles. Company will advance by ranks. Watch your footing on the slope. Try to avoid stepping on anyone important. And remember, we're professionals here. Let's give these good people a proper show. The skeleton named Roderick, who has finally managed to untangle his sword from his ribs and now stands holding it with proper military bearing, raises his hand with the gesture of a soldier asking permission to speak. So what exactly are our objectives? The briefing was a bit vague on account of us all being dead at the time, and the tactical situation seems rather different from what we were led to expect. Sir Bedivere considers this question while studying the village below, where the defenders are still arguing about how to load the crossbow, and Farmer Klaus has begun practicing net-throwing techniques on an unfortunate chicken that wandered into the square.
Excellent question, Roderick. Sergeant Thompson, what do our standing orders say about engaging living opponents?
A skeleton wearing the remains of a sergeant stripe steps forward with the precise movements of a career military man. His armor is more practical than decorative, marked with the dents and scratches that speak of extensive combat experience. When he speaks, his voice carries the authority of someone who has spent years translating officers' orders into practical action. So the manual clearly states that all combat operations should be conducted with honor, dignity, and minimal damage to civilian infrastructure. We're to avoid harming non-combatants, respect local customs and religious practices, and limit our activities to legitimate military targets. Also, we're specifically instructed to avoid trampling gardens unless strategically necessary.
Very good. And what about casualties?
We're to minimize harm to non-combatants, sir. Children and elderly are off limits entirely. Anyone who surrenders is to be treated with courtesy and respect. Standard rules of chivalric warfare apply with allowances for the unusual circumstances of our current existence. Splendid. Any other questions? Another skeleton raises his hand with the hesitant gesture of someone who is about to point out an obvious problem. So what if they don't actually want to fight? I mean, they look rather more concerned with hiding behind things than with forming up for glorious battle. Sir Bedivere looks down at the village, where indeed most of the inhabitants seem to be attempting to barricade themselves behind whatever they can find, rather than forming up for combat. The defensive preparations look more like a community preparing for a natural disaster than an army preparing for battle. He muses, stroking his jaw in a gesture that would be more effective if he had flesh to stroke. That does present a tactical challenge. Can't very well have a proper war if only one side shows up for the fighting. What do you think? This last question he addresses to you, as if you've become his unofficial advisor on local customs and expectations. Before you can answer, a commotion erupts in the village below that changes the entire character of the confrontation. Someone has apparently decided that the best defense against a skeleton army is to set off the village's entire supply of fireworks left over from the harvest festival. Bright flowers of coloured fire begin to burst in the sky above the village, illuminating the scene in brilliant reds and greens and golds that transform the moonlit landscape into something magical. The effect on both armies is immediate and completely unexpected. The villagers cheer, apparently thinking the fireworks will somehow drive off the supernatural threat through sheer audacity and noise. The skeletons, meanwhile, break formation entirely to point at the sky in evident delight, their military discipline temporarily forgotten in the face of something genuinely marvellous.
"Oh, how wonderful!" exclaims Sir Bedivere, clapping his bony hands together with genuine enthusiasm. "I say, we never had anything like that in my day. Are they celebrating our arrival? How thoughtful of them."
The fireworks continue to bloom overhead, each explosion adding new colours to the night sky and casting everything below in shifting rainbow illumination. Someone in the village has found the entire store of pyrotechnics that was being saved for special occasions, and they're setting them off with the desperate logic of people who figure that if you're going to face supernatural forces, you might as well do it with style. A particularly spectacular rocket explodes directly overhead, showering both the village and the hillside with harmless sparks that look like falling stars. The effect is so beautiful that for a moment everyone living and dead alike stops what they're doing to admire the display. And so begins what may be the strangest battle in history, not with the clash of steel on steel or the war cries of charging armies, but with a village-wide fireworks display that no one had planned and that both sides seemed to be enjoying immensely. In the shifting coloured light of the continuing pyrotechnics, you can see both armies looking at each other with what appears to be curiosity rather than hostility, as if everyone involved is beginning to suspect that this confrontation did not go according to anyone's expectations. The fireworks continue to bloom overhead in spectacular cascades of colour, transforming the night into something that belongs more in a fairy tale than on a medieval battlefield. Each explosion paints the scene in shifting hues, brilliant reds that make everything look like it's bathed in firelight, ethereal blues that give the skeleton army an otherworldly appearance, and golden bursts that illuminate the village square like captured sunlight. Under this festive canopy that no one had planned but everyone seems to appreciate, the two forces finally come face to face at the edge of the village, where the familiar cobblestone street meets the dirt path that leads up to the cemetery. The meeting point has an oddly symbolic quality, as if the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead has become a physical location where both sides can negotiate the terms of their encounter. Sir Edmund, the village's knight, has managed to organize about 24 men into something resembling a defensive line. They stand with various weapons, some carrying proper swords that have been passed down through families, others wielding farm tools that have been pressed into military service, and still others holding kitchen implements that were the first things they could grab when the alarm sounded. Farmer Klaus is still there with his fishing net, having ignored all attempts to convince him that skeletal warriors are not actually fish. The impromptu army represents a cross-section of village life. Hans the smith, with his massive hammer and makeshift armor, Willem the apprentice, struggling with his oversized sword, several farmers carrying pitchforks and scythes, the cooper holding a wooden staff that he's probably used for barrel making, and the innkeeper's son, armed with what appears to be a large rolling pin. They try to look brave and determined, and to their credit, most of them succeed. These are not professional soldiers, but they are people defending their homes and families, and that gives them a courage that military training alone cannot provide. However, it's also clear that none of them have the slightest idea what they're dealing with, or how one is supposed to conduct warfare against opponents who are already dead. The skeleton army approaches in perfect formation, their bones bleached white in the moonlight, and their empty eye sockets glowing that gentle red that has become somehow reassuring rather than frightening. Their equipment may be rusty and their tabards tattered, but they move with the precision of professional soldiers who know exactly what they're doing, even if what they're doing has never been done before in quite this way. The contrast between the two forces could not be more striking. Supernatural discipline meeting human improvisation, centuries of military training facing off against desperate courage and community spirit. Yet there's something oddly harmonious about the confrontation, as if both sides recognize that they're participating in something unprecedented and want to make sure they do it properly. The two armies stop about 20 paces apart, both sides apparently waiting for someone else to make the first move, or at least to establish what the rules of engagement might be. The silence stretches out, broken only by the whistle and pop of the continued fireworks overhead, and the nervous jingling of chainmail as the villagers shift from foot to foot, trying to work up the courage to either fight or flee. Finally, Sir Edmund steps forward and raises his sword in what he hopes is a suitably martial gesture. His voice carries across the gap between the armies with the authority of someone who has read about how these situations are supposed to work, even if he's never actually experienced one. In the name of the Holy Church, and by the authority of His Grace the Duke, I command you to return to your graves and trouble the living no more. The declaration hangs in the air for a moment, sounding appropriately official and knightly, though somewhat undermined by the fact that another spectacular firework chooses that moment to explode directly overhead, showering everyone with harmless but distracting sparks. Sir Bedivere steps forward from the skeleton ranks and removes his helmet in a courtly gesture that would not be out of place in the most refined noble court. The movement is performed with such natural grace that for a moment it's easy to forget that the person making it has been dead for centuries, or Sir Edmund de Milhausen. I presume, he says, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who has spent years at court and knows the proper forms of address. Sir Bedivere Thorncastle, late of the King's third heavy horse, at your service. A distinct pleasure to make your acquaintance, though I must say the circumstances are rather unusual.
It's Sir Edmund of Milhausen, actually. The knight replies, looking confused by the polite correction of his title. And you're supposed to be well dead. Oh, we are dead, Sir Bedivere confirms with the cheerful matter-of-factness of someone discussing the weather. Quite thoroughly dead, in fact, have been for some time now. Rather liberating, actually, once you get used to the idea. Has that armourer of yours been taking proper care of your equipment? That's a nice piece you're wearing, though the left shoulder guard looks like it could use some attention to the articulation points.
Sir Edmund glances down at his armour in complete bewilderment, temporarily forgetting that he's supposed to be conducting a supernatural confrontation. What? You're critiquing my armour. Professional interest, my dear fellow. Sir Bedivere explains with the earnest enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his trade. One doesn't stop caring about the technical aspects of warfare simply because one has shed one's mortal coil. That shoulder piece is binding slightly when you raise your sword arm. See how the plates catch? A good armourer could fix that in an afternoon. Proper equipment maintenance is essential for effective combat, whether one happens to be breathing or not.
But you're dead, and you're supposed to be evil, and I'm supposed to be fighting you.
Well, yes, I suppose that is the traditional arrangement, Sir Bedivere agrees thoughtfully. Though I must say evil seems like rather a strong word. We're here on official business properly summoned according to ancient compact. Very legal, very above board. Now, shall we get on with this battle? My men are getting restless, and Sergeant Thompson is quite strict about maintaining discipline and keeping to schedule. What follows is perhaps the most polite military engagement in recorded history. Sir Edmund raises his sword and charges forward with a battle cry that sounds more like a question than a war whoop, as if he's not entirely sure this is the right thing to do, but feels obligated to try. Sir Bedivere meets him with his own blade, and the two begin what can only be described as an educational sword-fighting demonstration. The sound of their blades meeting rings across the square like a bell, and both armies lean forward slightly to get a better view of what promises to be either an epic duel or an instructional exhibition.
Excellent form, Sir Bedivere calls out as they circle each other, the blades ringing together in a complex pattern of attack and defense. Though you might want to keep your elbow in a bit more, like so. See how that improves your reach and gives you better control over the blade's trajectory. I'm supposed to be killing you, Sir Edmund pants, swinging his sword in a wide arc that Sir Bedivere deflects with casual expertise.
Well, yes, in theory, Sir Bedivere agrees, parrying the blow and responding with a gentle thrust that Sir Edmund manages to deflect. But I'm already dead, which does present certain practical difficulties. Besides, this is much more civilized than actual mortal combat. We can focus on technique without worrying about permanent injury. Think of it as advanced training with a very experienced partner. Around them, other individual combats are breaking out, though each one seems to develop its own peculiar character, based on the personalities involved. Hans the Smith finds himself facing a skeleton, who introduces himself as Brother Marcus, formerly of the monastery of St. Albertus, and apparently a scholar of metallurgy and engineering. I say, Brother Marcus remarks, as Hans swings his massive hammer in a practiced arc. That's a beautifully balanced weapon. Did you forge it yourself? The proportions are quite elegant, and the head seems to be made from an unusually high-quality steel. Well, yes. Hans replies momentarily, forgetting that he's supposed to be terrified, and focusing instead on the professional pleasure of having his work appreciated by someone who clearly knows what they're talking about. It's based on a design my father taught me, but I modified the head to distribute the weight better and changed the angle of the striking surface to improve the impact dynamics. Fascinating. You know, I was something of a metal worker myself before I took holy orders and learned the finer points of illuminated manuscript production. Would you mind if I examined the craftsmanship more closely after we finished trying to kill each other? Of course. Professional curiosity, you understand. E. Meanwhile, young Willem has found himself confronted by what appears to be a skeleton barely older than himself, if skeletons can be said to have ages. The young undead warrior moves with the quick reflexes of youth, but there's something gentle about his approach that suggests he's not particularly interested in causing harm. First battle, the young skeleton asks, with evident sympathy, noticing Willem's obvious nervousness.
Is it that obvious? Willem squeaks, struggling to lift his oversized sword into something resembling a guard position.
The shaking gives it away, and the fact that your sword is bigger than you are, the skeleton observes kindly. Here, let me show you a proper grip. You want to hold it more like this. See, much easier on the wrists, and it gives you better control. The whole point is to make the weapon an extension of your arm, not a burden you're carrying around.
But aren't you supposed to be trying to kill me?
Well, theoretically, yes, but you seem like a nice lad. And I remember what it was like to be young and frightened and holding a weapon I didn't really know how to use. Tell you what, we'll have a proper practice bout and I'll teach you some basic techniques. Consider it community service. The most chaotic engagement involves Farmer Klaus, who has somehow managed to entangle 3 skeletons in his fishing net and is now trying to drag them toward the village, well, apparently under the impression that skeletons, like fish, need to be kept fresh in water until they can be properly processed. Klaus, his wife shouts, from behind a barricade of overturned carts. They're not trout, they're undead warriors.
Nonsense, woman. Klaus calls back, pulling harder on the net with the determination of someone who has never let reality interfere with his convictions. Look at them bones. Finest skeleton fish I ever did catch. Big ones. 2 probably been feeding well in the deep pools up by the cemetery.
The 3 trapped skeletons look at each other, or at least turn their skulls toward each other in a way that suggests mutual consultation about their current predicament.
Should we tell him? One asks, his voice muffled slightly by the netting.
I rather think it might break his heart, another replies philosophically. He seems so pleased with his catch. Besides, adds the third, it's actually quite cozy in here. Reminds me of being swaddled as a baby, except for the whole being dead part, and the fact that this gentleman seems to think we're edible. Throughout the village square, similar scenes of confused combat are playing out with the kind of surreal logic that belongs in dreams rather than historical chronicles. Greta the baker has somehow ended up in a heated discussion about bread recipes with a skeleton who claims to have been a master baker in life, their animated conversation punctuated by occasional half-hearted attempts to hit each other with kitchen implements. The secret to truly exceptional bread. The skeleton baker explains while ducking under Greta's rolling pin is not just the quality of the grain, but understanding the relationship between temperature, humidity, and fermentation time. You have to feel the dough, understand its moods and needs.
I've been baking for 20 years, Greta replies, trying to brain him with a wooden spoon. And no dead person is going to tell me how to make bread.
Oh, but my dear woman, death provides a unique perspective on the process. When you no longer need to eat, you can focus purely on the art of creation, rather than being distracted by thoughts of hunger. 2 elderly villagers have ended up sitting on a bench with an equally elderly skeleton, sharing what appears to be a wine skin that someone produced from the inn's reserves. They seem to be swapping stories about the good old days, their conversation occasionally interrupted when one of them remembers they're supposed to be enemies and makes a token gesture toward hostility. Father Aldrich has appointed himself as a sort of referee wandering between the various engagements and offering commentary like a scholar observing an interesting social experiment. "Excellent sword work from both parties there," he calls out cheerfully. "Very sporting." And over here we have what appears to be a philosophical debate about the nature of existence itself. How delightfully civilized this is. Exactly the kind of intellectual discourse our community needs more of. The only real violence occurs when someone accidentally steps on the tail of the village's large tabby cat, which responds with typical feline outrage by climbing up the nearest available surface, which happens to be one of the skeletons. The cat treats the undead warrior as a particularly oddly shaped tree, digging its claws into the bones for purchase and hissing indignantly at everyone within range. The skeleton, startled by the sudden appearance of a furious feline passenger clinging to his skull, begins running around in circles trying to dislodge his unwelcome rider while maintaining some semblance of military dignity.
"Get it off!" he wails, his voice rising to nearly hysterical levels. "I'm not afraid of swords or spears or crossbows, but I draw the line at cats. They're completely unreasonable creatures with no respect for proper military protocol."
This creates something of a chain reaction as other skeletons scatter to avoid their panic-stricken comrade, which causes several villagers to trip over the scattered bones, which in turn alerts the village geese, who had been sleeping peacefully until now, that something interesting is happening in their territory. Anyone who has ever encountered aggressive geese will understand what happens next. The birds emerge from their coop like feathered missiles launched by some demented siege engine, honking with outrage and pecking at anything that moves. They have apparently decided that this entire affair is taking place in their domain without proper permission, and they intend to restore order through the application of aggressive waterfowl justice. The geese attack with the kind of mindless fury that makes them more terrifying than most human armies. They go after skeletons and villagers with equal enthusiasm, apparently recognizing no distinction between the living and the dead when it comes to territorial violations. The battle, such as it is, quickly degenerates into a three-way confusion involving undead medieval soldiers, panicked villagers, and extremely indignant geese who seem determined to establish their dominance over the entire proceeding. Someone overturns a cart full of cabbages in the chaos, someone else drops a torch that sets fire to a hay bale, and through it all the fireworks continue to burst overhead in cheerful celebration of the madness below. You find yourself laughing despite everything, not because the situation isn't serious, but because it's so completely absurd that laughter seems like the only reasonable response. Here you are, witnessing what may be the first war in history, where both sides keep stopping to give each other constructive criticism and professional advice. The sight of an entire skeleton army being routed by a flock of angry geese, while villagers and undead warriors alike flee in all directions, strikes you as simultaneously ridiculous and somehow perfectly appropriate for this most unusual of nights. As the initial chaos settles into something resembling organized confusion, both sides begin to adapt their strategies to the unique circumstances they find themselves facing. The villagers, recovering from their initial shock and the unexpected assault by their own geese, start to realize that these undead warriors are not the mindless monsters they expected from the scary stories told around winter fires. The skeletons, meanwhile, are discovering that fighting living opponents presents challenges they hadn't anticipated during their centuries of rest. The tactical manuals they studied in life simply don't cover situations like what to do when your enemy tries to teach you improved combat techniques, or proper protocol when civilians want to discuss professional matters during battle. Greta the baker, ever practical and quick to adapt to changing circumstances, has set up what can only be described as a field kitchen in the village square. She's discovered that several of the skeletons retain vivid memories of meals they enjoyed in life, and she's found herself taking recipe requests in between bouts of combat and various attempts to establish who exactly is supposed to be fighting whom. Now, you said your grandmother's apple tart had what kind of spices? She calls to Sir Gareth a skeleton knight who claims to have run a prosperous inn before taking up the profession of arms. She continues kneading dough while dodging a wild sword swing from another undead warrior, her movements showing the kind of multitasking ability that comes from years of managing a busy bakery during market days. Cinnamon and a touch of nutmeg, Sir Gareth replies, parrying a blow from Hans the Smith while simultaneously gesturing to illustrate his culinary points. And she always used honey instead of sugar. Made all the difference in both texture and flavor. The honey helps the apples caramelize properly, and it adds a complexity that sugar simply cannot match. Honey. You say Greta makes a mental note while throwing a rolling pin at a skeleton who's gotten too close to her improvised cooking station. I'll have to try that, though it must be expensive. Honey costs more than our monthly grain allowance. But you have to think of it as an investment in quality. Sir Gareth continues still fighting, but clearly more interested in the culinary discussion. A reputation for exceptional baking brings customers from miles around. Better to make fewer items of superior quality than many items of mediocre standard. The most innovative defense, however, comes from an unexpected source, the village children. While the adults were forming battle lines and arguing about tactics and professional techniques, the children have been observing the skeletons with the kind of scientific interest that only young minds can muster, unencumbered by adult assumptions about what should or shouldn't be possible. Little Margaret, the cooper's daughter, makes the crucial discovery. She's been hiding behind a barrel watching the combat when she notices something odd about the skeleton movements that the adults have missed entirely. Papa, she calls to her father, who's attempting to fight a skeleton with a wooden stave while simultaneously trying to protect his daughter from the chaos around them. They can't see very well in the shadows. Watch how they stumble when they move away from the moonlight. Indeed, she's absolutely right. While the skeletons move with perfect coordination in the bright moonlight and under the illumination of the continuing fireworks display, they become noticeably clumsier when they enter the darker areas between buildings. Those red glowing eye sockets, it turns out, are better at looking impressive than at actual vision in low-light conditions. Young Willem, who has become surprisingly good friends with his skeleton opponent during their ongoing educational sword fight, decides to test this observation directly.
Is it true you can't see in the dark? He asks during a brief pause while they both catch their breath, and his skeletal instructor demonstrates proper footwork.
Been embarrassing, actually. The skeleton admits looking somewhat sheepish insofar as a skull can manage such an expression. You'd think being dead would come with some sort of enhanced supernatural senses, but apparently not. We navigate mostly by memory and the position of the moon. Torchlight rather messes with our depth perception, and shadows create all sorts of optical illusions. What about during the day? Willem asks, his curiosity overcoming his fear.
Oh, we can't manifest at all during daylight hours. Something about the mystical forces that bind us to this plane of existence. We're strictly a nighttime phenomenon, which does rather limit our operational flexibility.
This intelligence spreads quickly through the village with the speed that important information travels in small communities. Soon, the defenders are implementing a new strategy based on this weakness. Instead of trying to fight the skeletons directly in conventional combat, they begin using shadows and creative lighting to confuse and redirect their opponents. Father Aldrich, showing a tactical mind that his peaceful demeanor had previously concealed, organizes teams of children to run between buildings carrying torches, creating moving shadows that leave the skeletons constantly turning and stumbling as they try to track targets that seem to appear and disappear without warning.
It's like a dance. exclaims little Thomas, the innkeeper's son, as he leads a confused skeleton in circles around the well. You just have to know the steps and keep moving. They can't catch what they can't properly see.
The effectiveness of this tactic cannot be overstated. Within minutes, the village square resembles a bizarre ballet where children with torches lead groups of skeleton warriors through elaborate, choreographed movements that leave the undead army thoroughly disoriented. The skeletons, for their part, prove to be remarkably good sports about this development. Sir Bedivere actually applauds when he witnesses a particularly clever bit of shadow work that leaves 3 of his soldiers marching confidently into the side of a barn with a resounding crash of bone against timber.
Brilliant! He calls out, clapping his hands together with genuine appreciation. Absolutely brilliant, Sergeant Thompson. Are you taking notes? This is the sort of tactical innovation that wins campaigns. We're being outmaneuvered by people who probably can't even read military manuals.
Sergeant Thompson, who has been trying to maintain formation discipline while his troops are being led around by their metaphorical noses by a group of children armed with torches and an intuitive understanding of optical illusions, responds with the long-suffering tone of career military men everywhere. Sir, with respect, we're being outsmarted by civilians using tactics that aren't in any manual I've ever studied. Exactly, Sir Bedivere replies with the enthusiasm of someone who appreciates excellence, regardless of its source. Nothing more dangerous than practical intelligence unencumbered by formal education. These people are teaching us things about light and shadow that our military engineers never considered. We could learn something here about adapting to unexpected circumstances. The battle takes another unexpected turn when someone makes a discovery that changes everything. The skeletons have a weakness that no one could have predicted. This revelation comes about entirely by accident, when Farmer Klaus, still convinced he's dealing with some sort of large fish, attempts to clean his catch by scraping the bones with a stiff brush he uses for cleaning scales. The skeleton in question immediately dissolves into helpless laughter, his bones rattling together like castanets in a musical performance.
Stop! Stop! He gasps between chuckles that echo across the square. That tickles something dreadful. I haven't felt anything like that since I was alive. It's wonderful and terrible at the same time.
Word of this discovery spreads even faster than the shadow fighting technique had. Soon, children are darting between the adult combatants armed with feathers, brushes, and anything else that might provoke a ticklish response. The effectiveness of this tactic cannot be overstated. It's very difficult to maintain military discipline when you're being ruthlessly tickled by determined 8-year-olds who show no mercy whatsoever. Sir Bedivere finds himself under assault by no fewer than 5 children, each armed with chicken feathers and showing the kind of tactical coordination that would make professional military units envious. This is highly irregular, he manages to say, between fits of laughter that leave him staggering like a drunken man. There are rules about combat with non-combatants, Geneva Conventions, codes of chivalric conduct.
You invaded our village, little Margaret replies, applying her feather with scientific precision to what appears to be a particularly sensitive rib. That makes you fair game. Besides, we're not hurting you, we're just making you laugh.
But I can't stop laughing. It's completely undermining my bad military bearing. The sight of an entire skeleton army being reduced to helpless laughter by a coordinated tickling assault conducted by the village children is perhaps the most surreal development in an evening that has already redefined the concept of unusual warfare. The geese, meanwhile, have organized themselves into what can only be described as an air force with a clear command structure and tactical objectives. They've discovered that while they can't really hurt the skeletons, they can create enormous amounts of confusion by landing on skulls, building nests in rib cages, and generally treating the undead army as a collection of very oddly shaped trees that happen to move around. One particularly enterprising goose has taken up residence inside the chest cavity of a skeleton archer, poking its head out between the ribs and honking indignantly whenever anyone comes too close. The skeleton, for his part, seems rather fond of his new passenger and has begun introducing himself as Sir Geoffrey and Geoffrey, though no one is quite sure which Geoffrey is which. The advantage, Sir Geoffrey explains to anyone who will listen, is that Geoffrey here has excellent tactical vision from his position, and he's proven remarkably effective at intimidating opponents. Very few people are willing to engage in serious combat with someone who has a goose living in their chest. The most significant tactical development, however, comes from an entirely unexpected source music. It starts when someone notices that the skeletons seem to respond to rhythm in an almost involuntary way, their movements becoming more coordinated and synchronized when there's a steady beat to follow. When the church bells ring out their alarm, all the skeletons turn toward the sound like flowers following the sun. When someone starts clapping a steady rhythm, they begin to move in time with the beat. When a child starts singing a simple folk song, several skeletons begin humming along, apparently remembering melodies from their living days. Father Aldrich, ever quick to spot an opportunity for community building and creative problem solving, organizes the village musicians, a somewhat grand term for a collection of people who own various noisemakers and have some basic sense of rhythm, into an impromptu band. Old Heinrich brings out his fiddle, an instrument he carved himself from local wood, and strings with horsehair from his own animals. The blacksmith produces a set of pipes he made last winter, during the quiet months when there's less demand for metalwork. Someone finds a drum that usually accompanies harvest celebrations, and several children contribute by banging pots with wooden spoons, creating a percussion section that makes up in enthusiasm what it lacks in formal training. The resulting music might not win any awards for technical excellence, but it has a profound and immediate effect on the skeleton army. As the music begins a lively folk tune that everyone in the village knows by heart, the skeletons find themselves unable to resist the pull of the rhythm. What starts as a simple swaying motion quickly develops into full-scale dancing. Not the formal courtly dances they might have known in life, but something more primal and joyous, a wild celebration that has them spinning and leaping and clicking their bones together in time with the music.
I say, Sir Bedivere remarks, spinning past you with his arms spread wide like a scarecrow caught in a whirlwind. This is much more fun than traditional warfare. Why didn't anyone think of this approach before music as a tactical weapon? It's revolutionary.
The sight of an entire army of dancing skeletons proves too much for even the most frightened villagers. The absurdity and joy of the scene breaks down the last barriers of fear and suspicion. Soon, people are emerging from their hiding places to join the impromptu party, leaving their weapons behind in favor of participating in what has become the most unusual festival in the village's history. The battle lines dissolve completely as living and dead alike surrender to the irresistible pull of the music. Children dance with skeletons, adults share drinks with the undead, and everyone seems to have forgotten entirely that this was supposed to be a war. You watch in amazement as the village square transforms into a bizarre but joyful festival where the only casualties are preconceptions and the only victories are the small moments of connection between people who discovered they had more in common than they ever imagined. What happens next could never have been predicted by any military strategist, living or dead. As the music continues and the dancing grows more enthusiastic, the artificial barriers between the two sides begin to break down completely, dissolving like frost in the morning sun. Conversations that started as combat techniques and tactical discussions gradually shift to more personal topics, creating connections that transcend the obvious differences between the living and the undead. The transformation is remarkable to witness, where minutes before there had been two distinct armies facing each other across a divide of mortality and purpose. Now there's something that looks much more like a village festival that happens to include some unusual guests who don't need to worry about getting tired or catching cold. Sir Edmund finds himself sitting on the church steps with Sir Bedivere, both knights having set aside their weapons in favour of sharing a skin of wine that someone produced from the inn's reserves. The wine has been warmed with herbs and spices, creating a drink that fills the air with the scents of cinnamon and cloves and honey. The thing about being a knight, Sir Edmund is saying, his speech slightly slurred from the wine and the emotional exhaustion of the evening, is that nobody tells you how much paperwork is involved. Taxes, land disputes, reports to the Duke about everything from crop yields to bridge repairs to bandit activity. I spend more time with ledgers than I do with my sword. Sir Bedivere nods sympathetically, understanding exactly what his living counterpart means. In my day, it was all about honour and glory and proving oneself in battle. The songs made it sound so romantic, riding out to defend the innocent, fighting for justice, winning the favour of fair maidens. Nobody mentioned that most of knighthood involves sitting around waiting for something to happen, then filling out forms about it afterward.
Exactly. Sir Edmund gestures emphatically with his wine cup, sloshing some of the contents onto the stone steps. And don't get me started on the politics. Half the nobles at court spend more time plotting against each other than they do fighting actual enemies. It's like being trapped in a never-ending game where nobody will tell you the rules, but everyone expects you to play perfectly.
Has it really gotten that bad? Sir Bedivere asks with genuine concern, leaning forward with the interest of someone hearing news from a world he once knew intimately. In our time, political intrigue was more of a hobby for bored aristocrats. Most disagreements were settled with swords at dawn, which was more honest if not necessarily more civilized.
Oh, they still fight duels, Sir Edmund assures him. But now they spend weeks negotiating the terms first, then write strongly worded letters about the results, then hold formal inquiries about whether proper protocol was followed. Very civilized, very boring, very time-consuming.
It sounds exhausting, Sir Bedivere observes. Being dead has its advantages: no paperwork, no tax obligations, no political manoeuvring. Just the occasional resurrection for apocalyptic battles, and even those seem to be more social occasions than actual warfare. Meanwhile, throughout the village, similar conversations are taking place as the artificial boundaries between living and dead prove less important than the shared experiences of people who have faced similar challenges, even if separated by centuries. The skeletons, it turns out, are a treasure trove of historical information, having lived through events that are now legend to the current inhabitants. Brother Marcus, the skeleton monk, has attracted a crowd of listeners in the baker's shop, where he's regaling them with tales of the monastery where he once lived and worked. His voice carries the authority of someone who has actually witnessed the events he describes, lending weight to stories that might otherwise sound like fanciful tales. The illuminated manuscripts we created, Mool, he says, his voice filled with pride that transcends his current skeletal condition. Each letter was a work of art that took days or weeks to complete. We had brothers who spent months on a single page, adding gold leaf and precious pigments that cost more than most people earn in a year. The library contained copies of works that dated back to Roman times, books that preserved knowledge from the ancient world. What happened to it all? Asks Willem, the blacksmith's apprentice, who has been quietly nursing dreams of learning to read someday and sees in this skeletal scholar a potential teacher. Brother Marcus's skull tilts in what might be sadness, if skulls can be said to express emotion. War-plagued politics, the usual destroyers of beautiful things. Viking raids first, then internal conflicts, then the plague that took so many of our brothers that we couldn't maintain the scribal tradition. The last I heard, the monastery had been abandoned and the books scattered to the winds, sold to pay debts, or burned for fuel during hard winters. The listeners make sounds of dismay at this casual destruction of irreplaceable knowledge, understanding instinctively that something precious has been lost forever. Though, Brother Marcus adds more cheerfully, his tone brightening with remembered cunning, I did manage to hide several volumes in a secret chamber before my death. Perhaps they're still there waiting to be rediscovered by someone who will appreciate their value. The works of Aristotle, copies of Roman agricultural texts, even some medical treatises that could save lives if properly understood. Willem leans forward eagerly. But where did you hide them? Brother Marcus provides detailed directions to the abandoned monastery, along with careful instructions for finding the hidden chamber and preserving the books once they're discovered. Knowledge should not be buried with its keepers, he says. Perhaps someone young and eager to learn might benefit from those old books. He glances meaningfully at Willem, who blushes and nods eagerly, already planning an expedition to recover these lost treasures. Greta the baker has found herself in an intense discussion about cooking techniques with Sir Gareth, who apparently ran a prosperous inn before taking up the profession of arms. Their conversation has the quality of two masters discussing the finer points of their shared craft, the secret to really good bread. Sir Gareth explains, while helping her knead dough for tomorrow's baking is not just the quality of the grain, but understanding the relationship between the dough and its environment. You have to feel the dough understand its moods and needs. Bread is alive in its way, it breathes, it grows, it responds to temperature and humidity and the amount of attention you give it.
I never thought of it like that. Greta admits watching his skeletal hands work the dough with surprising skill despite their lack of flesh. But you're right, I can tell, just by touching the dough, whether it's ready for the oven, whether it needs more kneading, whether the yeast is working properly. It's almost like it talks to you.
Exactly. And the oven temperature too hot, and you get a crust like leather that nobody can chew, too cool, and the inside stays soggy and dense. It's an art as much as a craft, requiring intuition as well as technique. They continue their discussion while working together to prepare bread. For the next day, the skeletal innkeeper, sharing centuries of accumulated wisdom with a living baker who understands that knowledge has value regardless of its source. The children, meanwhile, have completely adopted several of the skeletons as new playmates and teachers. The undead warriors, who presumably haven't interacted with children for decades or centuries, seem delighted by the attention and the opportunity to share their knowledge with the next generation. Little Margaret has convinced a skeleton named Sir Robert to play a game that appears to involve taking apart his arm bones and reassembling them in different configurations, treating his detachable anatomy as the world's most unusual construction toy. "Can you make your hand do this?" she asks, contorting her own fingers into an impossible position that would be painful for any living person to attempt. "Well, let's see," Sir Robert replies gamely, detaching his hand entirely and rearranging the finger bones into the requested configuration. "How's that I can also do this?" He rearranges the bones into an even more impossible pattern that makes Margaret giggle with delight.
That's amazing! Can you do it with your toes too?
I suppose so, though I should mention that some assembly is required afterward, and I sometimes forget which bone goes where if I leave them apart for too long. Other children have gathered around different skeletons, each finding their own forms of entertainment and education. One group is learning about medieval weapons and armor from Sergeant Thompson, who demonstrates the proper care and maintenance of military equipment while explaining the tactical advantages of different weapon types. Another group has gathered around a skeleton who claims to have been a traveling minstrel, listening to songs and stories from an earlier age. His voice, despite lacking vocal cords, carries melodies that seem to come from the bones themselves, creating music that sounds like wind through autumn leaves. Father Aldrich has found himself in deep theological discussion with several of the undead soldiers who have questions about the afterlife that are somewhat more immediate and practical than the usual philosophical inquiries that occupy religious scholars. The thing is, Father explains a skeleton who introduces himself as Brother Benedict. We're obviously not in heaven, since we're still here walking around and talking to people. But we don't feel particularly damned either, which you'd think would be the case if we were bound for eternal punishment. It's more like being between appointments waiting in some sort of cosmic antechamber.
Fascinating. Father Aldrich muses, stroking his beard thoughtfully. The church teaches that the soul departs the body at death and goes immediately to its eternal reward or punishment. But your situation suggests something more complicated. Perhaps there are intermediate states that our theology hasn't fully explored. Oh, we're definitely dead, another skeleton chimes in cheerfully. No question about that. No pulse, no breathing, no need for food or sleep. But it's rather like being asleep, except occasionally something wakes you up for a while. Usually something important like tonight.
And what made tonight important? Father Aldrich asks, leaning forward with the interest of a scholar encountering new information that might change his understanding of fundamental questions. The skeletons exchange glances, or at least turn their skulls toward each other, in a way that suggests consultation about how much to reveal. We're not entirely sure. Sir Bedivere admits joining the theological discussion with the wine still in his hand. Something about a convergence of forces, a time when the barriers between life and death become thin enough to allow passage. We were supposed to rise for a great battle that would determine the fate of something important. The details were always rather vague, but this doesn't feel like an apocalyptic battle, Brother Benedict observes. This feels more like a community festival with unusually diverse attendants. As the night progresses and the conversations continue, the distinction between the living and the dead becomes increasingly meaningless. Someone has managed to get a proper fire going in the square, using wood from the overturned carts and broken furniture scattered during the earlier chaos. People have brought out whatever food they can find to share, creating an impromptu feast. The skeletons can't eat, of course, but they seem to enjoy the social ritual of gathering around a meal, sharing stories and advice, while the living members of the community enjoy bread and cheese and whatever else has been salvaged from the chaos. Stories are exchanged freely. The villagers share news of recent events, marriages and births and deaths, while the skeletons provide historical context that brings local legends to life. Someone produces a lute that survived the earlier confusion, and soon there's proper music to accompany the continuing festivities. A few couples, both living and dead, have even started dancing together, though the skeletons need to be careful not to accidentally leave any bones behind. The sight of a village woman waltzing with a skeleton knight while her husband dances with a undead archer creates images that would normally belong in nightmares, but which somehow seem perfectly natural in the context of this extraordinary evening. It's during this peaceful interlude, when it seems like the evening might continue indefinitely as an impromptu festival celebrating the unexpected connections between very different communities, that the first sign of real trouble appears. You notice it first as a change in the atmosphere that has nothing to do with the weather. The air becomes colder in a way that penetrates beyond clothing to chill the soul itself. And a wind springs up from nowhere, making the torches flutter and casting moving shadows that seem to dance independently of their sources. The skeletons notice it too, their relaxed postures suddenly becoming tense and alert. Sir Bedivere stops mid-conversation and tilts his skull toward the sky, as if listening to something only he can hear.
That's odd. He murmurs, his voice losing its earlier warmth and taking on a quality that suggests concern, possibly even fear. We're being summoned, but by whom? Our original orders were to serve until dawn, then return to rest. This feels like something else entirely.
Summoned by whom? Sir Edmund asks, though you can see him unconsciously reaching for his sword, despite the friendly atmosphere that has prevailed all evening. I'm not sure, Sir Bedivere replies, standing and looking toward the dark forest that borders the village. But whatever woke us tonight isn't finished with us yet. And I have the distinct feeling that this new development won't be nearly as pleasant as our current gathering. As if in response to his words, a horn sounds from the woods, not the bright, clear note of a hunting horn or a military signal, but something deeper and more primal, like the voice of the earth itself, given sound. The note seems to come from below as much as from any particular direction, as if it's rising from underground caverns or ancient places that have never seen sunlight. The effect on the skeletons is immediate and dramatic. They all freeze in place, their red eye glow flickering like candles in a strong wind. For a moment, you wonder if they're going to collapse back into bones, their brief resurrection ended by whatever force is calling to them. But instead they begin to move again, differently now, with the mechanical precision of puppets rather than the natural grace they've shown all evening. The change is shocking and disturbing. Where moments before you had been watching people, unusual people certainly, but people nonetheless, now you see something else entirely. The warmth and humour and humanity that had made these undead warriors such unexpected companions drains away like water from a broken cup, replaced by something cold and purposeful and utterly without mercy. What's happening? You ask Sir Bedivere, but when he turns toward you, his eye sockets burn brighter red than before, and his voice when he speaks sounds hollow and distant, as if it's coming from the bottom of a very deep well. The true purpose reveals itself. He says each word seeming to require enormous effort. We are called to our destiny, cannot resist. The binding. The skeletons begin to form ranks again, but not in the cheerful, somewhat disorganized way they did at the beginning of the evening. This time they move with grim purpose and mechanical precision, their weapons appearing in their hands, as if summoned by will alone. The friendly, almost comic army of earlier has been replaced by something that looks like it stepped out of humanity's worst nightmares about the undead. The villagers, sensing the change in mood, begin to back away nervously, their earlier comfort with these unusual visitors evaporating in the face of this transformation. The joyful atmosphere of the impromptu festival dissipates like morning mist, replaced by something darker and more threatening. From the forest comes the sound of approaching footsteps, not the light tread of animals or the heavy boots of men, but something that sounds like stone grinding against stone, like ancient statues coming to life and walking across marble floors, and with it a voice that seems to come from the very earth itself, speaking words in a language that no living person has heard for 1,000 years, syllables that seem to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones.
The real battle, it seems, is about to begin.
The temperature drops so suddenly that everyone's breath becomes visible in small puffs of vapor. The cheerful crackle of the bonfire in the square suddenly seems inadequate against the cold that seeps into your bones, a chill that has nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with something ancient and malevolent awakening in the darkness beyond the village. The skeletons have formed a perfect battle line facing the forest, but their movements are no longer their own. You can see the difference immediately gone is the casual camaraderie, the gentle humour, the human warmth that had made them such unexpected companions. Now they stand like soldiers carved from ice, their weapons held at identical angles, their empty sockets staring into the darkness with mechanical focus.
Only Sir Bedivere retains some semblance of his former personality, and even he seems to be fighting against some invisible force that wants to turn him into another mindless automaton. This is not what we agreed to, he manages to say, through gritted teeth that exist only in memory. We were to rise for a just cause, not for this.
What is it, you ask, moving closer to him? What's controlling you?
Ancient compact, he replies with obvious effort. Bound by magic older than the church. But this is wrong. We are being used for evil purpose.
The voice from the forest grows louder, chanting in that unknown language, and with each syllable, the skeletons stand straighter, their individuality draining away like water from a broken vessel. You realize with growing horror that you're witnessing the transformation of a group of people, yes people, despite their lack of flesh, into an army of mindless weapons. Father Aldrich steps forward, his face pale but determined. In the name of the Almighty, I command you to release these souls. His words seem to have some effect. The chanting falters for a moment, and several of the skeletons waver slightly. But then the voice returns stronger than before, and whatever brief respite the priest had provided vanishes. It's at this moment that something unexpected happens. Little Margaret, the cooper's daughter, who had been playing with Sir Robert's detachable bones, runs out from behind the barricades where her parents had tried to hide her.
"Stop it!" she shouts at the darkness. "You're being mean to my friends."
The voice from the forest pauses as if surprised by this interruption. Sir Robert the skeleton she had befriended turns his skull slightly toward her, and for just a moment his red eye glow flickers with something like recognition. "Margaret," he says in his own voice, "run, please. Don't let it take your memories of us as we were." But Margaret, with the fearless determination of childhood, plants herself firmly between the skeleton army and the village.
"No," she declares. "They're my friends. Sir Robert taught me how to whistle, and Sir Gareth promised to show me how to make honey tarts, and Brother Marcus was going to teach me letters. You can't have them."
Her words seem to echo in the cold air, and you notice something remarkable happening. Other villagers begin to step forward, not in fear, but in defense of the skeletons who had just hours before been their enemies. Hans the smith moves to stand beside Margaret. "She's right," he says firmly. "Brother Marcus and I were going to work together on a new forge design. He had ideas about temperature control that could revolutionize metalworking. Greta, the baker, joins them. Sir Gareth was teaching me about bread cultures from different regions. I've learned more about baking tonight than in the past 5 years. One by one, the villagers emerge from their hiding places, each sharing something they had gained from their interactions with the undead soldiers. Willem talks about Sir Geoffrey's lessons in swordplay that focused on defense rather than aggression. Old Heinrich mentions Brother Benedict's stories about monastic music that had given him new ideas for his fiddle playing. With each testimony, the skeletons seem to regain a little more of their humanity. Their rigid formation wavers, their mechanical movements become more natural, and their eye glow shifts from harsh red to the warmer ember-like glow you remember from earlier. The voice from the forest rises to a shriek of rage, and now you can see the source of the disturbance. Emerging from between the trees comes a figure that makes your blood run cold, tall, draped in robes that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it, with eyes like burning coals and hands that end in claws rather than fingers. This is clearly the sorcerer or necromancer who had bound the skeletons to his will, planning to use them as instruments of destruction. But his carefully laid plans are unraveling before his eyes, undone by the simple power of human connection and friendship.
They are mine. The dark figure howls in accented but understandable words. Bound by blood and bone and ancient compact, they will serve my will.
Sir Bedivere steps forward, and when he speaks, his voice is once again his own, cultured, amused, and utterly unafraid.
I'm afraid you've made a fundamental error in your calculations, old fellow, he says, conversationally. You assumed we were mere tools to be wielded, but we are and always have been people. And people, as these good villagers have reminded us, have the right to choose their own loyalties.
The sorcerer raises his arms and dark energy crackles between his fingers. You will obey. The compact cannot be broken. Ah, but there you're wrong again. Sir Bedivere continues, now sounding positively cheerful. The compact you refer to was made with soldiers who had no other loyalties, no other connections. But tonight we've gained something we never had before: friends. And friendship, my dear necromancer, is a magic older and stronger than any you command. As if to prove his point, the entire village, living and dead alike, begins to sing. It starts with Father Aldrich, who begins a hymn that everyone knows, but soon expands to include folk songs, drinking songs, lullabies, and even a few bawdy tavern ballads that make the more respectable citizens blush. The effect on the dark sorcerer is immediate and dramatic. The shadows that surround him begin to flicker and fade, his imposing height seems to diminish, and his burning eyes grow dimmer.
Impossible, he whispers. Music cannot break bindings forged in the deep places of the earth.
Music alone, perhaps not, agrees Brother Marcus, stepping forward with his fellow skeletons. But music shared between friends, music that celebrates connection rather than dominion, that my misguided colleague is a force that can reshape the very foundations of reality. The sorcerer makes one last, desperate attempt, hurling bolts of dark energy at the assembled crowd. But something remarkable happens. The energy simply dissipates, harmlessly absorbed by the collective warmth of the community that has formed between the living and the dead. Faced with the failure of his magic, the sorcerer's form begins to crumble. The robes that had seemed so imposing reveal themselves to be little more than shadow and illusion. The burning eyes fade to mere embers, then to nothing at all. And finally, with a sound like wind through dried leaves, the entire figure collapses into dust that is quickly scattered by the night breeze. In the sudden silence that follows, everyone looks around in amazement. The oppressive cold lifts, the unnatural darkness retreats, and the stars shine down with renewed brilliance. Well, says Sir Bedivere after a moment, that was rather more dramatic than I expected, though I must say it had a certain poetic justice to it. Little Margaret runs to Sir Robert and hugs him around what would be his waist if he had one. You're staying, aren't you? You don't have to go back to sleep now. Sir Robert kneels down to her level, his skull somehow managing to convey gentle sadness. I'm afraid we do, little one. The magic that brought us back was always temporary, but tonight has been extraordinary. We'll carry the memory of this with us wherever souls go when they rest. As the eastern sky begins to show the first pale hints of approaching dawn, the reality of the situation becomes clear to everyone. The skeletons are becoming more translucent, with each passing minute, their forms growing less solid as the night wanes. But there's no sadness in this farewell, no sense of tragedy or loss. Instead, there's a peaceful contentment that settles over the village like a warm blanket. The friendships formed in these few hours feel as real and lasting as any forged over years of ordinary acquaintance. Sir Bedivere gathers his men, his friends, around him in the village square. They stand in a loose circle, no longer the rigid military formation of earlier, but the casual arrangement of comrades saying goodbye after a pleasant evening together. "Gentlemen," he says, his voice already growing fainter as the dawn approaches, "I believe we can call this mission a complete success. We rose to fight a battle, and we did, though perhaps not the battle we expected. We fought against hatred with friendship, against fear with understanding, and against the darkness of malice with the light of human connection." "What will you tell the others when you get back?" asks Father Aldrich. "The ones who sent you on this mission in the first place?" Sir Bedivere chuckles, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, I suspect our superiors will be quite satisfied with the outcome. Evil was defeated after all, and peace was restored. The fact that it was accomplished through a village-wide dance party rather than traditional warfare simply makes it a more interesting story. One by one, the skeletons begin to say their individual farewells. Brother Marcus gives Father Aldrich a detailed description of where he hid those precious manuscripts, along with careful directions to the secret chamber in the abandoned monastery. "Knowledge should not be buried with its keepers," he says. "Perhaps someone young and eager to learn might benefit from those old books." He glances meaningfully at Willem, who blushes and nods eagerly. Sir Gareth shares his final bread-making secrets with Greta, including a recipe for a honey cake that he swears was legendary throughout 3 kingdoms. The secret ingredient, he whispers conspiratorially, is a small amount of good ale in the batter, not enough to taste, just enough to make the bread sing. Hans the smith receives detailed plans for the improved forge design from Brother Marcus, sketched quickly in the dirt before the growing dawn light makes such earthly concerns impossible. Each skeleton finds a way to leave some small gift of knowledge or wisdom with their new friends. Sir Geoffrey shares advanced swordsmanship techniques with Sir Edmund. Sergeant Thompson gives the village's amateur militia some tactical advice that might prove useful in future emergencies. Even the skeleton who had been carried around in Farmer Klaus's net manages to explain the principles of fish farming that could improve the village's food security. But perhaps the most touching farewell is between Sir Robert and little Margaret. The skeleton knight kneels down and carefully detaches one of his finger bones, a small white piece no larger than a child's thumb. "This is for you," he says gently. A reminder that friendship can exist between any 2 souls, no matter how different they might seem. And when you grow up and have children of your own, you can tell them the story of the night when the dead danced with the living and everyone went home happy. Margaret takes the bone, carefully holding it like the treasure it truly is. "I'll keep it forever," she promises. "And I'll tell everyone about my friend Sir Robert, the bravest, kindest knight who ever lived."
As the sun's first rays peek over the horizon, the transformation begins in earnest. The skeletons don't simply vanish or crumble to dust. Instead, they fade slowly like figures made of morning mist, touched by the warming light.
But as they fade, something wonderful happens. Each skeleton seems to glow from within, not with the red light of undeath, but with a soft golden radiance that speaks of peace and fulfillment. They wave goodbye to their friends, their empty sockets, somehow conveying warmth and gratitude. Sir Bedivere is the last to go lingering for a final moment to address the assembled villagers. "Thank you," he says simply, "for showing us that death need not be the end of courtesy, that war need not be the enemy of friendship, and that even the oldest magic is no match for an open heart and a willingness to see the person behind the appearance." He turns to you, the observer who has witnessed this entire extraordinary night. "And thank you, friend, for being here to see this story unfold." Stories only truly live when they have witnesses to carry them forward. Remember what you've seen here tonight and know that in a world that can sometimes seem dark and divided, connection and understanding are always possible. With those words, Sir Bedivere tips his helmet in a final salute and fades into the golden light of dawn, leaving behind only a sense of warmth and a village full of people who will never quite see the world the same way again. The sun rises fully over Millhausen, painting the village in soft pastels of pink and gold. The evidence of the night's extraordinary events is scattered throughout the square overturned carts that served as barricades, scorch marks from the fireworks, the remains of the bonfire still smoking gently in the morning air. But as the villagers emerge from their homes to assess the aftermath, they find something unexpected. Where each skeleton had stood when the dawn claimed them, small wildflowers have sprouted tiny white blooms that seem to glow with their own inner light, even in the full sunshine. Father Aldrich kneels beside one of these flower patches, his face filled with wonder. "They're not like any flowers I've ever seen," he murmurs. "It's as if the earth itself is celebrating." The villagers go about the business of returning their community to normal, but everything feels different now. Conversations are livelier, laughter comes more easily, and there's a sense of shared experience that binds everyone together in a way that hadn't existed before. Greta the baker immediately begins experimenting with Sir Gareth's honey cake recipe, and the aroma that soon emanates from her shop draws a crowd of eager taste testers. Willem starts pestering Father Aldrich about when they can organise an expedition to find Brother Marcus's hidden manuscripts. Hans the smith studies the forge plans scratched in the dirt and begins gathering materials for what promises to be a revolutionary improvement to his workshop. Little Margaret carefully places Sir Robert's fingerbone in a small wooden box that she decorates with painted flowers. She shows it to anyone who will listen, telling and retelling the story of her friend the Skeleton Knight, until it becomes a cherished part of village folklore. As the days pass, word of the strange events in Millhausen spreads to neighbouring communities. Travellers stop at the inn specifically to hear the story, and the village becomes something of a pilgrimage site for those seeking proof that miracles can still happen in an ordinary world. But perhaps the most lasting change is in the people themselves. The fear of death that had always lurked at the edges of their daily lives has been replaced by something warmer, an understanding that the end of life need not be the end of love, that friendship can transcend even the ultimate barrier, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can bring the greatest gifts. You find yourself returning to the village months later, drawn by curiosity about how the story ended. The wildflowers still bloom where the skeletons faded, now spreading in gentle patches throughout the village. Children play games that involve pretending to be friendly skeletons, and the annual Harvest Festival has been expanded to include a night of remembrance where the story is formally retold and the memory of those brief but profound friendships is honoured. Father Aldrich has indeed recovered the hidden manuscripts, and Willem has become his eager student. The boy shows remarkable aptitude for learning, and the priest confidently predicts that he will become a scholar of some renown. Greta's honey cakes have become famous throughout the region, and travellers often detour just to sample what locals call the bread that the dead taught us to make. Hans the smith's new forge design has proven so effective that smiths from miles around come to study his techniques. And little Margaret, now a bit older but no less spirited, still carries Sir Robert's fingerbone in her decorated box. She's become something of a local celebrity, the girl who danced with skeletons and lived to tell the tale. As you prepare to leave the village again, Father Aldrich approaches you with a warm smile. "You know," he says, thoughtfully, "we never did figure out exactly why you were there that night. It seemed quite fortunate that someone was present to witness everything." You consider his words, thinking back to that strange compulsion that had drawn you out into the moonlight to the cemetery where it all began. Perhaps that you reply, "Some stories are so important that they call their own witnesses into being." Father Aldrich nods sagely. Perhaps they do. And perhaps that's the real magic, not the raising of the dead or the defeat of evil sorcerers, but the way a good story can bring people together, create understanding where there was fear, and remind us that we're all more alike than different, regardless of whether we happen to be breathing at the moment. As you walk away from Millhausen for the last time, you carry with you the memory of that extraordinary night when the barriers between life and death proved to be far less important than the connections between souls. The story has become part of you now, as stories do when they touch something deep and true in the human experience. And somewhere in the back of your mind you find yourself listening for the sound of distant horns in the night, hoping that perhaps someday you might witness another impossible tale of friendship, triumphing over fear, of understanding, conquering hatred, and of the simple power of treating others, no matter how strange they might seem, with kindness and respect. The moon waxes and wanes, the seasons turn, and life goes on. But in a small village called Millhausen, where wildflowers bloom in unlikely places and children play games about dancing skeletons, the memory of one perfect night lives on, a reminder that magic is real, miracles can happen, and sometimes the dead can teach the living how to truly live. Sleep well, friend. Dream of dancing skeletons and village festivals, of brave knights and kind bakers, of children who see friendship where adults see fear, and of stories that remind us that love in all its forms is stronger than death itself.